What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Okay, so I need you to sit down for this one, because what I'm about to tell you is one of those stories that makes you question everything you think you know about what's really going on beneath our feet. And I mean that literally. This isn't some secondhand rumor or internet creepypasta. What you're about to hear comes from military sources, declassified fragments, and first-hand accounts from people who were actually there. People who, for decades, were told to stay quiet. And most of them still are. I've spent weeks piecing this together. Honestly, there were moments where I almost didn't want to keep digging, because the more I found, the more I realized why this story was buried in the first place. Now, before we get into this, if you're new here, welcome. This channel is dedicated to uncovering stories that don't get told anywhere else. The strange, the hidden, the things that powerful people would rather you never heard about. If that sounds like something you're into, do me a favor. Hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because trust me, you don't want to miss what's coming next. Alright, let's get into it. This story begins in 1974, somewhere in the Nevada desert, with a classified military construction project that was never supposed to make headlines. And it didn't, because what they found down there made sure of that. In the spring of 1974, a convoy of unmarked military vehicles made its way through one of the most desolate stretches of the Nevada desert. There were no road signs, no landmarks, nothing but dust and silence for miles in every direction. The men inside those vehicles had been handpicked for a classified assignment, and most of them had no idea what they were actually building. All they knew was that the project required absolute secrecy, specialized equipment, and a location so remote that even satellites would have trouble finding it. The official paperwork called it a communications relay station, but the scale of the operation told a different story. You don't send 300 men into the middle of nowhere just to set up some antennas. Something else was going on, and the people in charge wanted to make sure no one ever found out what it was. The man running the show was Colonel Harold Vance, a career military officer with a reputation for getting things done without asking unnecessary questions. He had overseen classified projects before, the kind that never appeared in any official record, and this one was no different. Vance reported directly to someone in Washington, though no one on site knew exactly who. He kept to himself, ran a tight operation, and made it clear from day one that curiosity was not welcome here. If you were on this project, you did your job, kept your mouth shut, and followed orders. Anything beyond that was above your pay grade. The men respected him, but they also feared him, and that was exactly how Vance wanted it. Now, working alongside Vance was a civilian contractor named David Chun, the chief engineer responsible for the actual construction. Chun was one of the best in his field, a man who had built underground facilities for both the military and private sector for over 15 years. He didn't care much for the secrecy, but the paycheck was good, and the engineering challenge was unlike anything he had ever faced. The plans called for a facility that went deeper than any standard bunker, with reinforced chambers designed to withstand almost anything. Chun didn't ask what those chambers were for, but he noticed things. He noticed that some of the blueprints had entire sections blacked out. He noticed that certain materials were being shipped in from laboratories he had never heard of. And he noticed that Colonel Vance got very uncomfortable whenever anyone asked about the project's true purpose. The excavation team itself was a mix of military personnel and civilian workers. All of them screened extensively before being allowed on site. These were experienced men, drillers, and engineers who had worked on similar projects in the past, but even they could tell this one was different. The security protocols were extreme, with armed guards patrolling the perimeter around the clock and strict communication blackouts enforced at all times. No phone calls, no letters, no contact with the outside world until the job was done. Some of the men joked that they might as well be on the moon because that's how isolated they felt out there in the desert, But the jokes didn't last long. There was something about that place, something in the air, that made people want to keep their heads down and finish the work as fast as possible. For the first few weeks, everything proceeded exactly as planned. The drilling equipment arrived on schedule, the crews worked in rotating shifts, and the excavation moved forward without any major setbacks. They were cutting through layers of rock and sediment, going deeper and deeper into the earth with military precision. At this point, everything seemed normal. Just another classified construction project in the middle of nowhere. The men fell into a routine, waking up before dawn, working until exhaustion, then collapsing into their bunks only to do it all over again the next day. It was grueling, monotonous work, but that's what they signed up for. Nobody expected anything unusual. Nobody expected that their drills were about to hit something that would change their lives forever. David Chun kept detailed logs of the excavation progress, documenting every meter they descended into the earth. By early June, they had reached a depth of 200 meters, right on schedule according to the original timeline. The geological surveys had predicted nothing but stable rock formations all the way down to the target depth. And so far, those predictions had been accurate. Chun was actually feeling optimistic, thinking they might finish ahead of schedule if things kept going this smoothly. He remembers writing in his personal journal that night, saying the project was going better than expected and that he might actually make it home in time for his daughter's birthday. He had no way of knowing that within 72 hours, everything would fall apart. He had no way of knowing what was waiting for them just a few dozen meters below. And here's something I want you to keep in mind as we move forward. Every single person involved in this project, from Colonel Vance down to the lowest ranking worker, had been through dozens of classified assignments before. These were not easily frightened men. They had seen things that most people couldn't even imagine, and they had learned to compartmentalize, to focus on the task at hand and ignore everything else. So when I tell you that what happened next shook these men to their core, I need you to understand the weight of that statement. We're not talking about superstitious civilians or inexperienced recruits. We're talking about hardened professionals who had spent their entire careers dealing with the unknown. And even they were not prepared for what they were about to discover beneath the Nevada desert. The night before everything changed, the site was quiet. Most of the men had turned in early, exhausted from another long day of drilling. A skeleton crew monitored the equipment while the desert wind howled outside the temporary structures they called home. David Chun was in his quarters reviewing the next day's drilling coordinates, and Colonel Vance was in the command tent going over status reports from Washington. Nobody felt any sense of danger or urgency. It was just another night in the middle of nowhere, the same as all the nights before it. But what they were about to find would change everything, because somewhere beneath their feet, buried under millions of years of rock and silence, something was waiting. And in less than 12 hours, they were going to wake it up. It was June 14th, 1974, just after 6 in the morning when the first drill team of the day began their descent into shaft number 3. The air was already hot, even at that early hour, and the men were eager to get underground where the temperatures were at least manageable. Everything about that morning felt routine, almost boring in its predictability. The equipment was running smoothly, the previous night shift had reported no issues, and the geological surveys showed nothing but more of the same dense rock they had been cutting through for weeks. David Chun was on site early, coffee in hand, watching the monitors as the drill bits chewed through the earth at a steady pace. They were at 260 meters and descending, right on track to reach the target depth within the next few days. Nobody had any reason to expect that within the hour, everything they thought they knew about this project would be proven wrong. At approximately 6:47, the primary drill encountered resistance. Now, this wasn't unusual in itself, because underground excavation always involves hitting harder layers of rock or unexpected mineral deposits that slow things down temporarily. The drill operator, a veteran named Marcus Webb, barely reacted at first. He had been doing this job for 20 years and had encountered every type of obstacle imaginable. So he did what he always did. He increased the pressure and let the machine do its work. But the drill didn't break through. The bit was spinning at full power, generating tremendous heat and friction, but it wasn't making any progress at all. Webb checked his instruments, assuming there must be some kind of mechanical failure, because in his entire career he had never seen rock that a diamond-tipped industrial drill couldn't penetrate. But the equipment was functioning perfectly. The rock just wasn't giving way. Now imagine you're drilling through solid rock, hundreds of feet underground, and suddenly you hit something that shouldn't be there. Something smooth. Something that your equipment can't even scratch. That's exactly what Marcus Webb was experiencing, and for the first time in decades, he didn't know what to do. He called David Chun down to take a look, and within minutes, the chief engineer was standing at the drill station, staring at the readouts with a look of utter confusion on his face. The sensors were showing that the drill bit was making contact with the surface, but the material composition readings were coming back as unknown. No tite, not quartz, not any mineral in the geological database. Chun ran the diagnostic 3 times, thinking the sensors must be malfunctioning, but the results were the same every time. Whatever was down there, it wasn't rock. Chun made the decision to pull the drill back and attempt a lateral bore, thinking that maybe they had just hit an unusually dense pocket of some rare mineral formation. It happened sometimes, these geological anomalies that didn't show up on surveys, and the standard procedure was simply to drill around them. So the team repositioned the equipment and started a new bore about 15 meters to the left of the original shaft. For the first hour, everything went smoothly, and Chun was already preparing his report about the minor setback when the drill hit resistance again. Same depth, same impossible hardness, same unknown material readings on the sensors. Chun felt something cold settle in his stomach as he realized what this might mean. They hadn't hit a pocket of unusual rock. They had hit something else entirely, something that extended at least 15 meters in width, and possibly much further. By midday, Colonel Vance had been notified and had made his way down to the excavation site to see the situation for himself. He stood there in silence as Chen explained what they had found, his face completely unreadable the entire time. When Chun finished, Vance simply nodded and ordered 2 additional test bores, one 50 meters to the north and another 50 meters to the east. He wanted to know how big this thing was before he reported anything to Washington. The results came back within hours, and they were not what anyone expected. Both test bores encountered the same surface at exactly the same depth. Whatever was down there, it wasn't just big. It was massive, extending at least 100 meters in every direction they had tested. And here's the thing that really made everyone nervous. The surface was completely uniform in every location. No seams, no joints, no variation of any kind. Natural geological formations don't look like that. Nothing natural looks like that. I want you to understand something about the mood on that site during those first few hours. There was no panic, no fear, nothing like what you might expect from a scene in a movie. These were professional men who had been trained to assess situations calmly and rationally, and that's exactly what they were doing. The prevailing theory among the engineers was that they had discovered some kind of ancient lava formation, maybe a volcanic glass deposit that had been buried millions of years ago and somehow compressed into an unusually hard state. It was unlikely, sure, but it was at least possible within the realm of known geology. Chun himself wrote in his log that afternoon that they were dealing with a significant but ultimately explainable anomaly. He was wrong, of course, but he had no way of knowing that yet. At this point, confusion was the dominant emotion, not fear. Fear would come later, once they got a closer look. Colonel Vance ordered a small camera probe to be sent down through the original shaft to get visual confirmation of what they were dealing with. The technology was primitive by today's standards. Just a basic fiber optic cable with a light and lens attached, but it was enough to transmit a grainy black and white image back to the surface. Chun and Vance gathered around the monitor as the probe descended through the narrow borehole, past layers of rock and sediment, until finally it reached the obstruction at 280 meters. What they saw on that screen made both men fall completely silent. The surface was smooth, impossibly smooth, with a dark metallic sheen that seemed to absorb the probe's light rather than reflect it. There were no natural textures, no irregularities, nothing that suggested geological origin. It looked manufactured. It looked like something that had been deliberately placed there, buried beneath nearly 1,000 feet of solid rock. For a long moment, nobody said anything. The only sound was the hum of the equipment and the distant rumble of generators on the surface. Chun remembers looking at Colonel Vance, hoping to see some kind of recognition in his eyes, some indication that the military knew what this was and had a protocol for dealing with it. But Vance looked just as lost as everyone else. Finally, the colonel spoke, and his words were simple but heavy with implication. He said they needed to get a sample of that material, no matter what it took, because Washington was going to want proof. Chun nodded and began planning the extraction procedure. Even though something in the back of his mind was screaming at him to stop, to seal the shaft and walk away and never look back. But he didn't listen to that voice. None of them did. And looking back now, after everything that happened, that was probably the biggest mistake they ever made. The next 48 hours were dedicated entirely to understanding what they had found. Colonel Vance brought in a specialized team from a military research facility, men with advanced degrees in material science and geology who arrived on site with equipment that most of the workers had never seen before. These weren't ordinary scientists. They moved with military precision, spoke in clipped technical jargon, and refused to answer any questions from the regular crew. David Chun was allowed to observe their work, but even he was kept at a distance, watching from behind a safety perimeter as the specialists set up their instruments around the primary shaft. The message was clear. Whatever this discovery was, it had just been elevated far above Chun's pay grade, and yet they still needed his expertise to navigate the underground environment. So he stayed, watching and waiting and trying to make sense of what was unfolding before his eyes. The first real analysis began with a simple objective to cut a sample from the surface for laboratory study. The team lowered a high-powered industrial laser down the shaft, the kind used to slice through reinforced steel in military applications. Chun watched the monitors as the laser made contact with the dark surface below, expecting to see the familiar glow of superheated material and the slow progress of a precision cut. Instead, he saw nothing. The laser was operating at full power, generating temperatures that should have melted through virtually any substance on Earth, but the surface remained completely unchanged. Not a scratch, not a scorch mark, not even a slight discoloration where the beam was focused. The scientists ran the laser for 15 continuous minutes before finally shutting it down. The lead researcher turned to Colonel Vance with an expression that Chen would never forget, a mixture of fascination and something that looked very much like fear. Here's where I need you to pay attention. This wasn't just unusual. This was impossible. No known material on Earth matches what they described. We're talking about a surface that could withstand industrial lasers, diamond drilling, and concentrated heat that would vaporize steel. The scientists tried everything in their arsenal over the next several days. They attempted ultrasonic cutting, chemical dissolution, and even controlled micro-explosions designed to fracture the material at a molecular level. Nothing worked. The surface absorbed every form of energy they directed at it without showing the slightest sign of damage or degradation. One of the researchers, a man Chun later learned had worked on classified aerospace projects for over 2 decades, was overheard saying that whatever this material was, it shouldn't exist. Not on this planet, not according to any known laws of physics or materials science. And that statement haunted everyone who heard it. Eventually, they managed to extract a microscopic sample, not by cutting or breaking the material, but by carefully scraping the surface with a specialized tool that collected individual particles too small to see with the naked eye. It was barely enough to analyze, but it was something. The preliminary results came back within hours, and they only deepened the mystery. The material appeared to be metallic in composition, but its atomic structure was unlike anything in the scientific literature. The isotope ratios were wrong, completely inconsistent with any element formed through natural processes on Earth. One scientist suggested that the material might be extraterrestrial in origin, perhaps a meteor fragment buried by geological activity over millions of years. But that theory fell apart when they examined the shape and uniformity of the surface. Meteors don't form perfectly flat plains. Meteors don't extend uniformly for hundreds of meters in every direction. Whatever this was, it hadn't fallen from the sky, it had been built. And then there was the color. Everyone who got close enough to see the surface through the camera feeds described it the same way. It was dark gray, almost black, but it didn't behave like any dark surface they had ever seen. Light didn't reflect off it normally. Instead, it seemed to bend around the edges, creating an optical effect that made the surface look almost liquid even though it was completely solid. Some of the workers said it hurt their eyes to look at it for too long, like staring at something that your brain couldn't quite process correctly. The scientists had no explanation for this phenomenon. They theorized it might be some kind of light-absorbing coating or a peculiar property of the material's molecular structure, but those were just guesses. The truth was, they had no idea what they were looking at, and that uncertainty was starting to spread through the camp like a slow poison, infecting everyone with a growing sense of unease that no one could quite articulate. The surface itself was completely featureless, and I mean completely. No seams, no joints, no bolts or welds or any indication of how it had been assembled. It was as if the entire structure had been formed from a single piece of material, cast or grown rather than constructed. This detail disturbed the engineers more than almost anything else because they understood what it implied. Human beings don't build things that way. Even our most advanced manufacturing techniques leave some trace of the construction process, some microscopic evidence of how the pieces were joined together. But this surface was perfect, absolutely flawless in a way that seemed to mock the very concept of human engineering. David Chun later said that looking at it made him feel small, not just physically, but intellectually. It was like standing in front of something that represented a level of technological advancement so far beyond human capability that comparison was meaningless. And that's when the first reports started coming in. Workers who spent extended time near the primary shaft began complaining of strange symptoms. Headaches that came on suddenly and disappeared just as quickly. Nausea that seemed to have no connection to food or illness. A persistent ringing in the ears that some described as almost musical, like a tone just barely within the range of human hearing. Most disturbing were the psychological effects. Men reported feeling watched, even when they were completely alone. They described a sense of pressure inside their skulls, as if something was pushing against their thoughts. One drill operator had to be removed from duty after he became convinced that the walls were breathing. The medical staff attributed these symptoms to stress and exhaustion, and officially, that explanation was accepted. But unofficially, everyone noticed that the symptoms only affected people who worked in close proximity to the shaft. Everyone else was fine. Colonel Vance ordered a reduction in the number of personnel allowed near the excavation site, limiting access to essential scientific staff only. He framed it as a safety precaution related to potential radiation exposure, but everyone knew that the Geiger counters had shown nothing unusual. The real reason was the growing unease that was spreading through the camp, an unease that threatened to become panic if it wasn't contained. Chun remembers walking through the temporary barracks that night and seeing the looks on the workers' faces. These were tough men, veterans of dangerous construction projects in some of the most hostile environments on Earth, and they were scared, not because of anything they could point to specifically, but because of what they couldn't explain. Something was wrong down there, something beyond the impossible material and the inexplicable readings, something that they could feel in their bones even if they couldn't put it into words. And the worst part was, they had only scratched the surface. Literally, they had no idea what was waiting for them inside. The first equipment failure happened on June 19th, 5 days after the initial discovery. A portable monitoring station positioned directly above the primary shaft suddenly went dark without warning. All of its instruments flatlined simultaneously as if someone had simply unplugged it from existence. The technicians who examined the equipment afterward found nothing wrong with it. No blown fuses, no damaged wiring, no logical explanation for why a perfectly functional system had simply stopped working. They replaced it with a new unit, ran full diagnostics, confirmed everything was operational, and positioned it in the same location. Within 3 hours, it failed in exactly the same way. This time, one of the technicians noticed something strange just before the shutdown. The readings on several instruments had begun to fluctuate wildly, displaying values that were physically impossible, as if the sensors were detecting something that shouldn't exist. Then everything went dead. After that, Colonel Vance ordered all sensitive electronic equipment to be kept at least 50 meters from the shaft opening, but distance didn't solve the problem. Over the following days, electronic failures spread outward from the excavation site like ripples in a pond. Flashlights would flicker and die despite having fresh batteries. Digital watches would stop, then start again hours later showing completely wrong times. The generators that powered the camp began experiencing unexplained surges and drops in output, forcing the engineers to implement a backup rotation system to prevent total blackouts. Most unsettling were the communication devices. The radios that connected the underground teams to the surface started picking up interference, a low hissing static that seemed to grow stronger whenever the equipment was pointed toward the shaft. At first, everyone assumed it was just electromagnetic noise from the rock formations, some kind of natural phenomenon that they hadn't anticipated. But then someone noticed the pattern. The static wasn't random. It pulsed. It had rhythm. And once you heard it, really listened to it, you couldn't convince yourself it was natural anymore. One of the radio operators, a young specialist named Thomas Briggs, became obsessed with the interference patterns. He spent hours recording the static, playing it back, analyzing the waveforms on whatever equipment still functioned reliably. What he found made him request an immediate meeting with Colonel Vance. The patterns weren't just rhythmic, they were structured. They repeated in sequences that followed mathematical progressions, intervals that corresponded to prime numbers and geometric ratios. Briggs wasn't suggesting the static was a message exactly, but he couldn't deny that it exhibited properties that seemed almost intentional, as if something was broadcasting on a frequency just beyond human comprehension. Vance listened to the report, examined the data, and then ordered Briggs to stop his analysis immediately and destroy all of his recordings. The official reason was that the investigation was interfering with essential communications. The real reason, everyone suspected, was that Vance didn't want anyone asking questions about what might be generating those signals from deep underground. Multiple men, trained professionals, started reporting the same thing, the feeling that something was watching them. Not from above, from inside the walls. The sensation was strongest near the shaft, but it began spreading throughout the camp as the days wore on. Workers would stop mid-task, convinced that someone was standing directly behind them, only to turn around and find nothing there. Others reported hearing whispers in empty corridors, voices that seemed to come from inside their own heads rather than from any external source. Sleep became difficult for almost everyone. Those who managed to drift off described vivid dreams of vast underground spaces, of walking through endless dark corridors that pulsed with that same rhythm they heard in the static. Several men woke up screaming, unable to remember what they had seen, but absolutely certain that something terrible had been watching them in the darkness. The camp doctor started distributing sedatives, but they barely helped. Whatever was affecting these men, it wasn't something that could be treated with medication. The physical symptoms grew worse as well. Nausea became so common that it stopped being reported, simply accepted as a normal part of working on this project. Headaches evolved into migraines that left men incapacitated for hours. Several workers experienced nosebleeds that started without warning and stopped just as suddenly. But the most disturbing symptom was the temporal disorientation. Men would go underground for what felt like a 30-minute inspection and emerge to discover that 3 hours had passed. Others experienced the opposite, spending what they were certain was an entire shift below only to find that barely an hour had elapsed on the surface. Their watches were useless, either stopped or displaying times that made no sense. The only way to track time was by the position of the sun, and even that felt unreliable, as if the normal rules of reality had somehow become suggestions rather than laws. David Chun documented these reports in his personal journal, noting that he himself had begun experiencing moments of missing time that he couldn't explain. On June 23rd, everything escalated. One of the civilian engineers, a man named Robert Harmon, who had been part of the original excavation team, suffered a complete psychological breakdown while working near the shaft. According to witnesses, he suddenly stopped what he was doing, stood perfectly still for nearly a minute, and then began screaming that something was inside his head, that it was looking at him from underneath the floor. It took 4 men to restrain him, and even then he continued thrashing and screaming until the medical team sedated him. When he regained consciousness hours later, he had no memory of the incident, but he refused absolutely to go anywhere near the excavation site again. He kept repeating the same phrase over and over. "It knows we're here. It knows we're here." Harmon was evacuated that same night, officially listed as suffering from severe heat exhaustion and dehydration. His medical records were sealed, and everyone on site was ordered not to discuss the incident with anyone ever. After the Harmon incident, Colonel Vance implemented what he called Protocol 7, though nobody knew where that name came from or if it was standard military procedure. Access to the excavation site was restricted to a rotating team of no more than 6 people at a time, with mandatory 4-hour rest periods between shifts. No one was allowed underground for more than 2 hours consecutively. Anyone displaying unusual symptoms was to be immediately removed from duty and evaluated by medical staff. Communication about the project, even among team members, was limited to essential operational matters only. Speculation, theorizing, and informal discussion of the discovery were explicitly forbidden. Vance brought in military police to enforce these rules, men who had no idea what the project was about and had been ordered not to ask questions. The camp that had once felt like a construction site now felt like a prison, or perhaps a quarantine zone, designed to keep something contained. The question nobody dared to ask was whether the containment was meant to keep something in, or to keep the rest of the world out. That night, Chun sat alone in his quarters, unable to sleep despite the sedatives the doctor had given him. Through his window, he could see the lights around the shaft entrance, the armed guards pacing their perimeter, the faint hum of generators struggling against whatever force was draining their power. He thought about Harmon, about the look in his eyes when they carried him away, about those words he kept repeating. "It knows we're here." Chun had always been a rational man, a scientist who believed in evidence and logic and the fundamental comprehensibility of the universe. But sitting there in the darkness, listening to the distant rhythm that seemed to pulse up from the earth itself, he felt that rationality crumbling. Something was down there, something that had been waiting in the darkness for longer than human civilization had existed. And now, because of their drilling, because of their endless human need to dig and discover and understand, they had made contact with it. The question that kept him awake, the question that would haunt him for the rest of his life, was simple. What happens when it decides to make contact with us? The microscopic samples that had been collected from the surface were transported off-site on June 25th under heavy military escort. David Chun watched as the sealed containers were loaded into an unmarked helicopter, accompanied by two of the research scientists who had been working on the analysis. Nobody told him where the samples were going, and he knew better than to ask. All he was told was that the material required equipment and expertise that wasn't available in the field, and that results would be communicated through Colonel Vance when they became available. The helicopter lifted off into the pale morning sky and disappeared over the mountains, carrying with it fragments of something that shouldn't exist. Chun stood there long after it was gone, feeling the weight of what they had discovered pressing down on him like a physical force. Whatever those samples revealed, he knew instinctively that nothing would ever be the same. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. The laboratory that received the samples was never officially identified in any document that has since surfaced. Based on the timeline and logistics, researchers who have studied this case believe it was likely one of several classified facilities operated by the Department of Defense for the analysis of sensitive materials. These labs were designed to handle everything from captured Soviet technology to experimental weapons components. Staffed by scientists with the highest security clearances and bound by oaths of secrecy that lasted until death. The samples from Nevada arrived with minimal documentation, labeled only with a project code that meant nothing to the receiving technicians. But within hours of beginning their analysis, the lead scientist reportedly contacted Washington directly, bypassing the normal chain of command entirely. Something in those initial readings had triggered a response that suggested this was far more significant than anyone had anticipated. Additional specialists were brought in overnight, and the lab was placed under lockdown conditions normally reserved for biological hazard containment. The first comprehensive results were transmitted back to Colonel Vance on June 28th, and the report was unlike anything the military had ever received from a materials analysis laboratory. The document, portions of which were later leaked by an anonymous source, began with a series of standard measurements and observations before arriving at a conclusion that must have seemed almost absurd to anyone reading it for the first time. The material's atomic structure was based on elements that existed on the periodic table, primarily iron, nickel, and several rare earth metals, but the isotopic ratios were completely wrong. Every element on Earth has a characteristic isotopic signature, a fingerprint created by the specific nuclear processes that formed it billions of years ago. The samples from Nevada didn't match. Their isotopic composition suggested they had been formed under conditions that don't exist anywhere in our solar system, possibly in the heart of a neutron star or some other extreme cosmic environment that human science could barely comprehend. Let me be clear about what this means. The scientists weren't saying they didn't recognize the material. They were saying it shouldn't exist. Not on this planet. The report used careful, measured language, as scientific documents always do, but between the lines you could sense the profound unease of the researchers who had written it. They proposed several hypotheses to explain the anomalous readings, including contamination, instrument error, and the possibility of an elaborate hoax, but each hypothesis was systematically dismantled by the evidence. The samples were genuine. The instruments were functioning correctly, and no known process, natural or artificial, could account for what they had found. One section of the report, heavily redacted in the leaked version, apparently discussed the theoretical possibility of extraterrestrial origin, though the specific conclusions reached in that section remain classified to this day. Whatever those scientists wrote, it was apparently significant enough that someone decided it should never see the light of day. The dating analysis proved even more problematic than the composition study. Standard radiometric techniques rely on the predictable decay of certain isotopes over time, but those techniques assume the material being tested was formed through natural processes with known starting conditions. The Nevada samples violated those assumptions so completely that the dating methods simply didn't work. The instruments returned errors or produced results that contradicted each other by millions of years. or indicated ages so vast that they exceeded the formation of the Earth itself. Eventually, the scientists gave up on precise dating and instead focused on contextual evidence, examining the geological layers surrounding the structure and using those as a proxy for age. Their conclusion, presented with appropriate caveats and uncertainties, was that the structure had been in its current position for at least 10,000 years and possibly much longer. 10,000 years. That predates the pyramids, predates Stonehenge, predates every known human civilization. Whatever built that structure did so before our ancestors had even invented writing. The final section of the report addressed the most unsettling question of all, the question of origin. After eliminating natural geological processes, meteor impact, and every other explanation they could devise, the scientists were left with only one conclusion. The structure was artificial. It had been manufactured, constructed, deliberately placed beneath the Nevada desert by some form of intelligence. The report stopped short of speculating about what that intelligence might be, but the implication was clear enough to anyone reading between the lines. This was not built by humans. It couldn't have been. Human beings didn't exist when this structure was created, and even if they had, they possessed nothing resembling the technology required to work with materials like this. Someone else made it. Something else. And that something had been here, on our planet, doing things we couldn't comprehend, long before the first human being ever looked up at the stars and wondered if we were alone. When Colonel Vance received the report, he immediately classified it at the highest level and restricted access to a handful of individuals with direct need to know. David Chun was not among them, though he later learned the general conclusions through conversations with scientists who had seen the document before it was locked away. The effect on Vance was visible to everyone who interacted with him in the days that followed. The man who had always projected absolute confidence and control now seemed uncertain, even afraid, as if the ground beneath his feet had suddenly revealed itself to be thin ice over a bottomless abyss. He spent hours in encrypted communication with Washington, arguing about something that the workers could only guess at. Rumors spread through the camp that the project was about to be shut down, that everyone would be sent home and ordered to forget what they had seen. But the days passed and no shutdown order came. Instead, something else happened, something that made the scientific findings seem almost trivial by comparison. I need you to understand the position these men were in by the end of June 1974. They had discovered something impossible, analyzed it with the best technology available to the most powerful military on Earth, and arrived at conclusions that fundamentally challenged everything humanity believed about its place in the universe. They were standing at the edge of the greatest discovery in human history, and they were absolutely terrified. Not because of what they had found, but because of what they still didn't know. The structure was artificial. It was ancient beyond comprehension. It was made of materials that shouldn't exist. But what was it for? Who built it? And most importantly, was it still active? Those questions haunted everyone on that site, spoken and unspoken, as they waited for guidance that never seemed to come. And then, on the night of July 1st, they got their answer. Not from Washington. Not from any human source. They got their answer from the structure itself. And nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for what it had to say. The night of July 1st began like any other at the Nevada site. The sun dropped below the horizon around 8:30, painting the desert in shades of orange and purple before giving way to the vast darkness that only exists in places far from human civilization. A skeleton crew of 12 men remained on duty, the minimum required to maintain essential operations and security around the excavation site. Most of the scientific team had retired to their quarters, exhausted from weeks of analysis that had produced more questions than answers. Colonel Vance was in the command tent, reviewing yet another batch of communications from Washington that seemed to say nothing while using an impressive number of words. David Chun sat alone in the mess hall, pushing food around his plate without appetite, his mind still churning through the impossible implications of the laboratory report. Everything was quiet. Everything was calm. And then, at exactly 11:47 p.m., the seismic sensors began to scream. The first alert came from a monitoring station positioned 30 meters from the primary shaft, one of several that had been installed to detect any geological instability that might threaten the excavation. The technician on duty, a young specialist named Eric Saunders, initially assumed it was another equipment malfunction, the latest in a long series of electronic failures that had plagued the site since the discovery. But when he checked the readings, his blood ran cold. The sensors were detecting vibration, a low-frequency oscillation emanating from somewhere deep underground. The pattern was like nothing he had ever seen in his training. Earthquakes produce chaotic, irregular waveforms as tectonic forces release energy in unpredictable bursts. This was different. This was regular. This was rhythmic. The waveform on his screen pulsed with mechanical precision, rising and falling in perfect intervals like the heartbeat of something impossibly vast. Saunders stared at the display for a full 30 seconds before he remembered to breathe. Then he ran. Colonel Vance arrived at the monitoring station within minutes. Still buttoning his jacket, his face set in the grim expression of a man who already knew that whatever he was about to see would be bad. Chun was right behind him, having heard the commotion from the mess hall and followed the sounds of running boots and shouted orders. They crowded around the display as Saunders explained what he was seeing, his voice steady but his hands trembling visibly as he pointed to the waveform patterns. The vibration was originating from a depth of approximately 280 meters, exactly where the structure had been discovered. It wasn't a natural seismic event. It wasn't mechanical interference from their own equipment. Something down there was generating a pulse, a rhythmic emission of energy that was propagating through the surrounding rock and being picked up by every sensor on the site. As they watched, the pulse continued, steady and unvarying, like a machine that had just been switched on after a very long sleep. This is the moment everything changed. Because up until now, they could tell themselves it was just some ancient artifact, something dead, a relic of whoever or whatever had built it, abandoned and forgotten beneath the desert for thousands of years. But that night, standing in that cramped monitoring station with the waveforms pulsing across the screen, they realized the truth. It wasn't dead. It was waiting. And now, for reasons they couldn't begin to understand, it had decided to wake up. Chun later described the feeling as something beyond fear, a kind of primal recognition that they were in the presence of something, so far beyond human comprehension that fear itself seemed inadequate. The structure wasn't just a mysterious object anymore. It was active. It was doing something. And they had absolutely no idea what that something might be or what it meant for the men standing directly above it. Vance ordered an immediate evacuation of all personnel from the area surrounding the shaft, pulling everyone back to a perimeter at least 200 meters from the excavation site. The men moved quickly, professionally, but Chun could see the fear in their eyes as they gathered their equipment and retreated into the darkness. These were soldiers and engineers who had faced danger before, but this was different. You can fight an enemy you understand. You can prepare for disasters that follow natural laws. But how do you respond to something that defies everything you know about reality? The pulse continued unabated as they established the new perimeter, its rhythm unchanging, its source unknowable. Someone had set up portable floodlights around the shaft entrance, and Chun found himself staring at that dark opening in the earth, half expecting something to emerge from it at any moment. Nothing did. But the waiting, the not knowing, was almost worse than any monster could have been. Within the hour, Vance had established a secure communication link to Washington and was transmitting real-time data from the seismic sensors. Chun wasn't privy to those conversations, but he could see the colonel's face through the window of the command tent, and what he saw there frightened him more than anything else that night. Vance looked lost. This was a man who had spent his entire career in classified military operations, who had seen things that would break ordinary people. And he looked like a child who had just discovered that the monsters under the bed were real. The conversations went on for hours, voices raised in argument, long silences punctuated by bursts of urgent speech. Outside, the men huddled in small groups, speaking in whispers, watching the shaft entrance as if expecting the earth itself to open up and swallow them whole. The pulse continued, steady, rhythmic, patient. Whatever was down there, it was in no hurry. It had already waited 10,000 years. What was one more night? The scientists who remained on site scrambled to make sense of what was happening, running every analysis they could think of with the equipment that still functioned. The pulse appeared to be electromagnetic in nature, though it also had acoustic and possibly gravitational components that their instruments couldn't properly measure. Its frequency was just below the threshold of human hearing, which explained the physical symptoms that many of the men had been experiencing since the discovery. They were literally being vibrated by something they couldn't hear, their bodies resonating with a signal from deep underground. One researcher theorized that the pulse might be some kind of automated response, a system that had been triggered by their presence or their probing of the structure. Another suggested it might be a communication attempt, a signal being broadcast to someone or something that wasn't them. But these were just guesses, desperate attempts to impose human logic on something that seemed to operate by entirely different rules. The truth was, they had no idea what the pulse meant. They only knew that it had started and that it showed no signs of stopping. As dawn approached on July 2nd, the pulse was still going, unchanged in its rhythm, unchanged in its intensity, as if it could continue forever without depleting whatever power source drove it. Chun stood at the edge of the perimeter, watching the first rays of sunlight creep over the mountains, and tried to process everything that had happened. In the span of a few weeks, they had discovered something that rewrote human history, analyzed materials that shouldn't exist, and now witnessed evidence that whatever they had found was still functional after millennia of dormancy. He thought about the implications, not just for this project or for the military, but for humanity as a whole. We were not alone. We had never been alone. Something else had been here before us, had built structures beyond our comprehension, and had left them buried beneath our feet like time capsules waiting to be opened. And now, because of their digging, because of their endless human curiosity, one of those capsules had begun to stir. What would happen when it fully awakened? What would emerge from that darkness? Chun didn't know, but standing there in the pale morning light, listening to a rhythm that had no human source, he was absolutely certain that they were about to find out. The order came down from Washington at 6:14 in the morning on July 2nd, less than 7 hours after the pulse had first been detected. Colonel Vance gathered the entire remaining crew in the central assembly area, his face drawn and pale from a sleepless night of encrypted communications with people whose names would never appear in any official record. He spoke for less than 5 minutes, his voice flat and mechanical, delivering the news that everyone had somehow known was coming. The project was being terminated, effective immediately. All personnel were to prepare for evacuation within 12 hours. No equipment was to be removed from the site. No personal items that had been in contact with the excavation area. Nothing but the clothes on their backs and whatever was necessary for the transport home. Questions were not permitted. Explanations would not be provided. The men listened in stunned silence, and when Vance finished speaking, he simply turned and walked back to the command tent without another word. The next 12 hours were a blur of controlled chaos as 300 men scrambled to abandon a site they had spent weeks building. Chun moved through it all in a daze, watching as equipment worth millions of dollars was simply left where it stood. As research materials were loaded into containers marked for destruction rather than preservation. As armed guards took up positions around the perimeter with orders to ensure that nothing and no one left the designated evacuation zones. The pulse continued throughout, that steady rhythm emanating from somewhere deep below, a constant reminder of why they were fleeing like refugees from their own project. Some of the men worked in grim silence, professional to the end. Others muttered prayers under their breath or cast nervous glances toward the shaft entrance, as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. The military police watched everything with cold, impassive eyes, their weapons visible reminders that cooperation was not optional. Think about this. The U.S. military, with unlimited resources, abandoned a project overnight, left millions of dollars in equipment underground, and told everyone involved to forget it ever happened. This wasn't a strategic retreat or a planned decommissioning. This was flight. This was panic dressed up in the language of protocol and procedure. Whatever those communications from Washington contained, whatever analysis had been performed on the pulse data and the laboratory results, the conclusion had been clear enough to trigger an immediate evacuation. The most powerful military force in human history, an organization that had faced down nuclear threats and won a world war, had looked at what was happening beneath the Nevada desert and decided that the only appropriate response was to run, not to study, not to contain, not to attempt communication, to run and to seal the door behind them and to pretend that none of it had ever happened. The sealing of the excavation site began before the last personnel transports had even left the ground. Chun watched from the window of his helicopter as military engineers moved in with equipment that had been trucked in overnight. Massive concrete mixers and steel reinforcement materials that must have been staged nearby in anticipation of this exact scenario. They were going to bury it, he realized. Not just close the shaft, but fill it entirely. Hundreds of meters of concrete and steel poured into the earth to create a barrier between the surface and whatever lay below. The scale of the operation was staggering, requiring resources and coordination that would normally take weeks to arrange. But somehow it was all ready, all prepared, as if someone somewhere had always known that this moment would come. As the helicopter banked away and the site disappeared behind the mountains, Chen caught one last glimpse of the shaft entrance. That dark wound in the earth that had changed everything. Within hours, it would be sealed forever. Or at least, that was the plan. The debriefing began the moment they landed at a military installation whose location was never disclosed to the participants. Men were separated into small groups, isolated from each other and questioned individually by intelligence officers who seemed to already know everything that had happened. Chun spent 14 hours in a windowless room answering the same questions over and over, describing every detail of the discovery and its aftermath until his voice was hoarse and his mind felt empty. The officers were professional but relentless, probing for inconsistencies, testing his memory, making sure that every fragment of information had been extracted and cataloged. When it was finally over, they presented him with a document, a non-disclosure agreement unlike anything he had ever seen. The language was absolute. He was forbidden from discussing any aspect of the project with anyone ever under penalty of imprisonment and prosecution under laws that weren't even cited by name. The threat was clear. Talk and your life is over. Sign and walk away. Everyone signed. What choice did they have? Chun watched as man after man emerged from the debriefing rooms, their faces blank, their eyes hollow, each one clutching a copy of the same document that now bore their signature. They had been transformed from workers and soldiers and scientists into keepers of a secret so profound that even acknowledging its existence was a crime. The military didn't just want their silence. It wanted their forgetting, a complete erasure of everything they had seen and heard and felt during those weeks in the Nevada desert. Some of the men seemed almost relieved, eager to put the experience behind them and return to normal lives. Others looked broken, haunted by knowledge they could never share and questions that would never be answered. Chun felt something in between, a numbness that he suspected would eventually give way to something much worse. He had touched the edge of an abyss, and the abyss had touched him back. That wasn't something you could simply forget, no matter what documents you signed. The official story was almost insulting in its banality. According to the records that would later be released through various Freedom of Information requests, the Nevada project had been a routine underground construction initiative that was canceled due to budgetary constraints and geological complications. The site was described as having been properly decommissioned and restored to natural conditions. There was no mention of the discovery, no mention of the laboratory analysis, no mention of the pulse. The men who had been there simply didn't exist as far as the official history was concerned. Their names redacted from every document, their involvement erased as completely as if they had never set foot on that site. It was a masterclass in institutional denial, a demonstration of how easily reality could be rewritten when the people in charge decided that the truth was too dangerous to acknowledge. The project had happened. 300 men knew it had happened. And yet, according to every official source, it had never happened at all. Chen was discharged from his contract with a generous severance package and a final reminder that the consequences of disclosure would be severe. He returned to civilian life, took a job with a private engineering firm, and spent the next several decades pretending to be a normal person with normal memories and normal concerns. But he never forgot. How could he? Some nights he would wake in a cold sweat, the rhythm of the pulse echoing in his mind as clearly as if he were still standing at that perimeter, watching the shaft entrance in the pale morning light. He thought about the others, the men he had worked alongside during those terrifying weeks, and wondered if they were haunted by the same memories. He thought about the structure, still buried beneath tons of concrete and steel, still pulsing in the darkness, still waiting for something that only it understood. And he thought about the future, about what would happen when someone else eventually discovered what they had tried so hard to hide. Because secrets like that don't stay buried forever. The earth keeps its promises, but it doesn't keep them quietly. Sooner or later, the truth always finds its way to the surface. 50 years have passed since the events in the Nevada desert, and officially, nothing happened there at all. The location has never been acknowledged in any government document. The project has never been referenced in any declassified archive, and the names of the men involved remain hidden behind layers of redaction and denial. But the area itself tells a different story. To this day, the coordinates where the excavation took place remain restricted, designated as part of a military testing range that the public is forbidden from entering. No explanation has ever been given for why this particular stretch of empty desert requires such careful protection. There are no visible installations, no obvious military value, nothing that would justify the armed patrols and surveillance systems that have monitored the area continuously for 5 decades. On paper, it's just empty land. In reality, it's one of the most carefully guarded locations in the continental United States. And no one in authority has ever been willing to explain why. Modern satellite imagery has provided some tantalizing glimpses of what might be happening at the site. Independent researchers who have studied publicly available images over the years have documented periodic bursts of activity. Convoys of military vehicles appearing without warning, temporary structures being erected and then dismantled within days. Equipment that doesn't match any known military hardware being transported under heavy guard. These episodes seem to occur at irregular intervals, sometimes years apart, sometimes clustered in brief periods of intense activity. Then the site goes quiet again, returning to its appearance of abandoned emptiness while the restricted zone remains firmly in place. No one knows what triggers these visits or what work is being conducted during them. Requests for information under Freedom of Information laws have been consistently denied on grounds of national security, a classification that has been maintained through multiple administrations and shows no signs of being lifted anytime soon. The men who were there in 1974 are old now, those who are still alive. Most have kept their silence, honoring the agreements they signed and the threats that accompanied them. But over the decades, a handful have spoken, always anonymously, always carefully, always with the understanding that they were risking everything by sharing what they knew. Their accounts have surfaced in obscure forums, in conversations with trusted researchers, in deathbed confessions to family members who later shared the stories with the world. And here's what's remarkable. Despite being separated by time and geography, despite having no contact with each other for 50 years, their stories are consistent. The details match. The timeline holds together. The descriptions of the discovery, the effects, the pulse, the evacuation, all of it aligns in ways that would be impossible if these men were simply making things up. They saw something real. They experienced something true. And they've carried that burden in silence for half a century. David Chun passed away in 2019, having never publicly acknowledged his involvement in the Nevada project. But in his final years, he reportedly told family members that not a day went by when he didn't think about what they had found beneath the desert. He described the experience as the defining moment of his life, the event that divided everything into before and after. Before, he had believed that human beings were the pinnacle of intelligence on this planet, that our civilization represented the highest achievement of evolution. After he knew better, we were not alone. We had never been alone. And whatever was down there, whatever had built that structure and set it pulsing in the darkness, it was still there, still waiting, still functioning according to purposes that human minds couldn't begin to comprehend. Chun died without answers, just like everyone else who had been there. But he also died certain of one thing: the truth would eventually come out. Secrets that big don't stay buried forever. The official position of the United States government remains unchanged after 50 years. There was no project. There was no discovery. There is nothing unusual about the restricted zone in Nevada, and any claims to the contrary are the products of overactive imaginations and conspiracy theories. This denial has been maintained with remarkable consistency across multiple decades and administrations, suggesting either that the truth really is mundane, or that someone decided long ago that the public could never be allowed to know what was found. Consider the resources required to maintain a cover-up of this magnitude for this length of time. The personnel rotations, the document controls, the surveillance systems, the coordination between agencies. If this was all about nothing, if there really was no discovery beneath the Nevada desert, then the government has invested extraordinary effort in protecting an empty secret. That doesn't make sense. You don't guard nothing. You don't threaten people with court-martial over nothing. Something is there. Something was found. And for 50 years, someone has been making very sure that the rest of us never learn what it is. 50 years later, the questions remain. What did they find? Why did they leave? And perhaps most disturbing of all, what was that pulse? Because if that structure is still active, still functioning after thousands of years buried beneath the earth, then someone or something built it to last. They built it to survive whatever happened on the surface, to continue operating through ice ages and extinctions and the entire span of human civilization. They built it to wait. But wait for what? A signal from somewhere else? The arrival of its creators? Some predetermined moment encoded in its design from the very beginning? We don't know. The men who were there don't know. The government officials who have maintained the cover-up for 5 decades probably don't know either. All we have are questions and a restricted zone in the Nevada desert and the accounts of a few brave souls who decided that some truths are too important to take to the grave. And maybe that's the most unsettling part of this whole story. Not the discovery itself, not the impossible materials or the ancient construction or the pulse that sent 300 men fleeing into the night. What's truly unsettling is the silence. The absolute impenetrable silence that has surrounded this event for 50 years. Because that silence tells us something important. It tells us that whatever they found down there, whatever conclusions were reached in those classified communications between Nevada and Washington, the people in charge decided that we weren't ready to know. They looked at the evidence, they weighed the implications, and they concluded that the truth was too dangerous, too destabilizing, too fundamentally reality-altering to ever be shared with the public. That decision has been upheld for half a century. And that means somewhere, in some vault or database or classified archive, the answers exist. Someone knows what's beneath the Nevada desert. Someone knows what the pulse means. Someone knows why we're still watching that empty stretch of land after all these years. They know, and they're not talking. So where does that leave us? It leaves us with a story that shouldn't be true, but probably is. It leaves us with questions that deserve answers, but will likely never receive them. It leaves us staring at satellite images of an empty desert, knowing that beneath the surface, something ancient and impossible is still there, still pulsing, still waiting for whatever comes next. The men who found it are almost all gone now, their silence preserved unto death. The structure they discovered remained sealed beneath tons of concrete and steel, a tomb for secrets that someone decided humanity wasn't ready to face. But the earth has a long memory, and concrete doesn't last forever. Someday, maybe decades from now, maybe centuries, someone will dig in that desert again. They'll break through the barriers we erected, descend into the darkness we fled from, and come face to face with whatever we tried so hard to hide. And when that day comes, I hope they're more prepared than we were. I hope they're ready to hear whatever message has been waiting down there in the silence, because the pulse hasn't stopped. It's been going this whole time. And sooner or later, someone is going to have to answer it. So yeah, that's the story. That's what happened beneath the Nevada desert in 1974. At least as far as we can piece it together from the fragments that have survived 50 years of official denial. I don't know what's really down there. I don't know if we'll ever find out. But I do know that stories like this don't come from nowhere. Too many people saw too much, and their accounts matched too closely to be dismissed as fantasy or coincidence. Something happened. Something was found. And whatever it was, it scared the hell out of people who don't scare easily. That's worth thinking about. That's worth remembering. Because if they're still watching that site after all these years, if they're still guarding an empty patch of desert with armed patrols and classified protocols, then maybe it's not as empty as they want us to believe. Maybe something down there is still waiting. And maybe, just maybe, it's only a matter of time before it decides to stop waiting. Anyway, that's all I've got for today. If you made it this far, thank you for watching. If this story got you thinking, leave a comment and let me know what you believe. Hit that like button if you want more content like this, and subscribe if you haven't already, because trust me, this is just the beginning. There are more stories out there, more secrets buried in places we're not supposed to look, and I'm going to keep digging until I find them. Until next time, stay curious, stay skeptical, and never stop asking questions. I'll see you in the next one.